Hey guys, so my name's Evans, and I'm going to be representing the English department in the junior college. And I'm going to do a little talk. So give me a second here. And here we go. I'm just going to go into screen share and talk about this. Now this is something I'm quite interested in. Sociocultural theory. And I'm going to try and explain why I'm interested in it. Now, the main reason is because it's a theory about culture, and people are interested in culture. And I think it helps to explain why things are the way they are. I'll try and make that clear as we go through that. Okay, so there's sociocultural theory. As you can see, it's a kind of theory about society and culture. Okay then, so this is the basic idea. We're going to be thinking about understanding cultural differences. So in other words, it's understanding, explaining why these cultural differences exist. We know they do exist, but why do they? How do you explain it? Okay, so understanding cultural differences. Think of some examples of cultural difference. Now, I bet if I asked you to say a cultural difference between Western countries, say America or the UK, and Japan, I bet you'd come up with a certain example, right? So I think it'd probably be something like this. Here's, I guess this is somebody's bedroom or something. As you can see, this person is wearing shoes inside. And this is very, very common. People always give this example. And it's kind of an easy example, but you think, well, why? Why does it exist? Think about what that means. Now, you could say, for example, is it true people from Western countries always wear shoes in the house? Well, that's not really true, right? I mean, sometimes they don't. Some people in Western countries take their shoes off. Right? So it's not really true they always do, right? That's kind of going a bit too far. So it's not always. Not always. Is it usually? Maybe usually, right? Often wear shoes in the house? Maybe. Probably more often than Japan anyway, right? And then you say, well, is it true that people from Japan always take their shoes off in the house? Well, again, it's probably true in the house, right? It's probably not true about public places, like in university and school, shops. You don't take your shoes off to go into shops usually. Maybe in some restaurants, but not always, right? But in the house, probably. In a private house, probably yes. They always take their shoes off. And then you say, well, okay, that's Japanese people. How about Chinese people? Right? How about people from other East Asian countries? How about people from East Asia? Right? It seems yes, usually. Right? So there's a kind of a difference there. Usually people from, say, China, Korea, Japan do take their shoes off more often, right, than people from Western countries like America or the UK and so on. So there's a kind of generalization. There's a generalization, not always true. It's generally true. So anyway, cultural differences. And I think if you look at this picture, you can see there's something kind of really different, right? You look at this is Japanese, the entrance to the house, the genkan, as you know, right? And then if you look at, say, for example, a Western style house, it's probably going to be something like that. Right, so this is kind of nice, big, I suppose, rich house in Japan, probably. And then this is a nice, big, rich house in somewhere like London or somewhere like that. I don't know where it is, but yeah, some Western country. You can see it's kind of different. Right? Look at this big area here. Right? It's big space. And you've got like shoes laid out for guests to come in. It's a nice, comfortable space for guests to come into the house. Whereas in the Western style house, it's a nice house, but not very much here. As the outside and then the inside, there's no real difference, right? Whereas here, you've got the outside and then there's the inside, and then there's this kind of middle area. So that's kind of, that's a big difference. And then you think, well, why? Well, why does that exist? Why is it different? So we can say that cultural differences do exist, right? And everybody would probably give this example. Cultural differences do exist, but why do they? Yeah. Why do they exist? That's kind of the question, right? It's easy to say they do exist, but explaining why they exist is maybe a bit more difficult. But I would say that's what makes it interesting. Okay, all right then, so let's have a look. Now you could say, for example, a lot of people say, deep down everybody's the same. Thinking about culture. In the end of the day, you could say that everybody is basically the same. I think that's probably true, right? Deep down, all human beings are the same, but there are big differences, right? We're also very different, right? So you could say, if you wanted to, you could say, people do say deep down we're all the same. Human beings are all the same in the end, right? Deep down, but we're also very different. And I think it's those differences which are kind of interesting in thinking about explaining those differences. So let's see how we can do. So why do those differences exist? Now, an easy answer to that, why we are very different, is that our minds are different. I mean, like the mind of a Japanese person, for example, and the mind of a person from the UK is going to be different. And you say, okay, that's an easy answer. It doesn't really mean very much, though. By just saying somebody's mind is different. So, so what? Right? Well, in a way, you can understand if you start thinking about the way we grow up. So, for example, I'm British, and I grew up in the UK. Right? So my experiences growing up are going to be different from somebody from Japan growing up. And one way to explain the differences is to say that our minds develop in culture. Right? So all the way our minds kind of grow, right? And the way our minds become our minds, it all happens in culture. So any development experienced by us and our minds actually happens in culture. Right? Our minds develop in culture. That's really what sociocultural theory suggests. So our minds develop in culture. So my mind developed in culture, but it was British culture. And your mind probably developed in Japanese culture, say, for example, right? Or Chinese culture, or Philippine culture, or whatever culture it is, but it developed in that culture. And because our minds develop in culture, our minds are very different in many ways. So there you are, you get the idea. So our minds develop in culture. You've got these kids, they're in a British school or something, I guess. And they're having certain experiences, they're changing, their minds are developing, and it's all happening in culture. Another way of saying that's the same thing is that all mental development takes place in culture. And if you say all mental development takes place in culture, then it becomes very difficult to separate culture and the mind. Right? If you think about your mind, you think of your head, your brain, and so on, the way you think. But if you say that all that develops in culture, then it becomes very difficult to separate. Right? So where's culture and where's the mind? Right? What's the difference? And it's kind of difficult to separate them. You can't separate them really. And mind and culture kind of become the same thing. Yeah. So basically, you got the idea here: all mental development, the mind develops, right? And it takes place in culture. Right? So all mental development takes place in culture. That's the basic idea, one of the basic ideas of sociocultural theory. And as a result, basically, then mind and culture cannot be separated. It's very, very difficult to say, okay, that's mind, that's culture, because it's kind of all the same thing. Yeah? So you can't really separate. So mind and culture cannot be separated. That, again, is one of the ideas of sociocultural theory. Which in a way is a bit like saying mind and culture are the same thing. Yeah? Can't be separated. So they're kind of, well, it's kind of the same thing. So your experience of culture is different from mine. Our minds are different. And because our minds are different, the mind develops in culture, and that's why we are very different. Right? The way we think is very different. The way we see the world is very different. So you can say, deep down we're all the same, but also we're very different. And one possibility is that we even see the world differently. In other words, when you see the world, you look around and you see things. Maybe the things you see are different from the things I see. You could say, well, we're all the same deep down, so you kind of think maybe we see everything the same. But there are reasons to think maybe that's not true. We actually see the world in different ways. So we see reality differently. Yeah. So our kind of awareness of reality is different. Yeah. So we see things, I suppose, from different angles, from different perspectives. Yeah. And then, sort of if you think, well, okay, those are really, really big differences, then it starts to, help us explain why cultural differences exist. And one question is like, sort of, well, okay, if we see things differently, then you think, well, what am I? I mean, the self, me, right, the individual. What is that? If we see things very differently, it kind of asks questions about what we are. And one thing about the Western self, right, it's talking about me, right, the self. One idea is the Western self is kind of static. It doesn't change. It doesn't move. It's always kind of, we always kind of bring the same thing with us. It's static. It doesn't move. It doesn't change. Right? That's one suggestion. So for Western people, the self doesn't change. The self is always the same. And for Western people, being unique, being different from other people, is regarded as a good thing. It's the self is unique. It's I am unique. My self doesn't change, and being unique is good. So for the Western individual, I think for the Westerner, individual goals are important. So what I want to do, my goals, my family, for my career, for my education, for my health, those are all very important from a Western perspective. The individual goal is important. And one suggestion is, again, this is from sociocultural theory, is that for East Asian people, the individual goal isn't quite as important. Right? So for Western people, the individual goal is very important. But for East Asian people, it's not quite as important. Right? I mean, nobody's saying it's not important, but not as important. And for East Asian people, it seems that collective goals for the team, for the group, for the school, for your class, they would be more important than for Western people. Right? So for Western people, team goals are important, but they're not quite as important. And for East Asian people, individual goals are important, but they're not quite as important. Okay, so there's a difference in the way you see it. For Western people, individual goals are more important than for East Asian people on the whole. Okay, so there's a bit of a difference there. And also for East Asian people, it seems that the idea of the self, me, right, may change depending on the situation. And it seems that East Asian people kind of understand that. They know that, yourself may be a different thing depending on the situation. And for Western people, it's kind of difficult to understand that. So I suppose you could say it's easier for East Asian people to understand that the self may change depending on the situation. And for East Asian people, partly because of that, it seems that relationships are more important than for Western people. Right? So the way you understand yourself is more in connection with other people, right? Your relationship to other people, relationship to other groups, and so on. And your self kind of depends on that. Yeah. So relationships are kind of more important for East Asian people than they are for Western people. Western people, the self doesn't change. Being unique, being different from other people is kind of very important, regarded as very important. And so, relationships, connections with other people are not quite as important as they are for East Asians. So there's a bit of a difference there. And one kind of result of that is that we think that Westerners tend to see the world as separate objects. Right? So in other words, you've got, the self is unique, doesn't change. For East Asians, you've got this kind of connection. Everything is connected. Everything is understood in terms of connections. Right? So relationships are very important. Your relationship to other people is very important. You understand yourself in terms of relationships to other people. Now, for Western people, those kind of connections are not quite as well understood, right? And that kind of has an effect on the way we see things. Right? So for Westerners, we tend to see the world as separate objects. Right? So in other words, if we look at this here, we say, well, there's the sun, it's a separate object, and these are trees, right? Trees are separate objects, right? Whereas rather than thinking, well, okay, you're looking through the woods, through the forest. The forest would be the collective. So anyway, Westerners tend to see the world as separate objects, and East Asians tend to see the world as complex substance. So I suppose you could say this is a forest or woods here, right? It's a substance, a thing. Right? And that seems to be, it's like, there's quite a big difference. Right? So Westerners, usually we tend to just understand the world as separate objects, different separate things. Whereas East Asians kind of see it as kind of a mass, a collective thing with lots of different connections. Substance against objects, which seems like kind of an amazing idea, but they've done experiments which kind of show this. So they did an experiment on children and adults. There's two professors, basically. There's Professor Imai and Professor Gentner. They did this experiment, and they kind of show people, children or adults, this thing. They say, oh, here's the thing, right? This is the thing. And then they'd say, okay, now which of these two trays has the thing, right? And you kind of got to guess, is it tray A, which is the same shape as the thing, or is it tray B, which is the same substance, right? The same material as the thing. And kind of interesting that Western people, it's not always true, right? But a lot more Western people would choose tray A, right, than East Asian people, who would tend to choose tray B, right? So it's not always, right? Some Western people choose tray B, some East Asian people choose tray A, but generally speaking, more Western people would choose tray A as the thing, the shape, rather than the substance, right? And more East Asian people chose tray B, which is the kind of the substance is the thing. So that's a kind of interesting difference. And again, it's not everybody, right? But generally speaking, is a strong tendency, which is kind of interesting. So anyway, the experiment has asked people which tray has the thing, is it tray A or tray B? And Americans more often chose tray A, yeah. They would choose that, the shape of the object. And Japanese people more often chose tray B, yeah. I guess, as I say, it's not always, right? Not everybody does that, but yeah, it's more often, which is kind of interesting. So this is the basic idea, right? That Westerners tend to see separate objects, right? So this is the title of this book, The Geography of Thought, and you can see here, the Westerner sees the tree, right, the object, right? Tends to see the separate objects, whereas the East Asian person tends to see the whole connection, the whole thing in connection, right? In this case, the forest or the woods. Yeah. So that's the basic idea. And I suppose you could say that East Asians tend to see connected substance. They'll see the substance rather than the object, and they'll see the connections. And you think, well, why? Right? Why would that be true? I suppose that's the question. How do you explain that? East Asians tend to see connected substance, whereas Westerners tend to see separate objects. Why would that be? Why would that happen? Yeah, that's I suppose that's the question. That's what sociocultural theory tries to do, tries to explain why those differences exist. Yeah? And this is actually the title of the book, right? So the Westerner sees the tree. Why do Westerners tend to see the individual object? Yeah. So, and it's kind of interesting because they've done studies on learning language, and it seems that English-speaking children learn nouns faster than verbs. Right? So in other words, the noun is the object, right, the actual thing, whereas the verb is kind of connecting things. Right? that seems to suggest that the object, the individual object, is kind of more important. So Westerners tend to see the individual object, and even children will learn nouns faster than verbs. And then you've got the East Asian. The East Asians tend to see the whole, the whole thing with connections, the substance. They see the whole. Why is that? And in fact, it seems that Japanese children learn verbs faster than nouns. So again, verbs connecting objects. The connection seems to be more important than the actual object itself for East Asian people. And for Japanese children, learning words tend to learn verbs faster than nouns. It's kind of an interesting fact. Well, why is that? Right? How do you explain this difference? Right? Why is there a difference between Westerners and East Asians? Right? And for sociocultural theory, you just try to explain these things. Usually goes back to history. Right? You explain differences in terms of history. And one way of thinking about this is to look at ancient Greek philosophy, right? Which is kind of at the roots of culture, right? Talking about 5,000, 6,000 years of history, right? And ancient Chinese philosophy, right? So in other words, the beginnings of the roots of East Asian culture, civilization, and again going back about 5,000 or 6,000 years. Right? So in other words, ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Chinese philosophy, it's kind of the same sort of period. It's all happening about the same time. You're going from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. In both cases, kind of societies built on agriculture, growing food, living in the same place for long periods of time. Yeah, but as you can see, very different in many ways. Right? So it's happening about the same time, right? About 5,000, 6,000 years ago. It's kind of based on the same thing. It's based on agriculture, growing food, staying in one place for long periods of time, not moving around so much. But at the same time, it's very kind of different, right? In kind of sense, well, okay, ancient Greek and ancient Chinese philosophy is really different. Okay. Now, it's like, even though they were both founded on, agricultural practices, these different cultures were very, very different in many ways, right? And ancient Greek philosophy, the way they think, the way people think, and the ideas they had, and the way they understand the world. One big feature of ancient Greek philosophy was things like debate and competition, right? Now, very often people will say that in ancient Greek culture and in Western culture generally, things like debate is very important, right? And in ancient Greek philosophy, the idea of debate and competition was very important. And related to that, like personal freedom, right, and personal action, right? You're free to do things. You can debate. You can have your own ideas. You can compete against other people. And personal freedom and action are very important. Yeah. And you think about debate. These people are here having a debate now. They're actually debating. They're talking about things. They're arguing about stuff. Think about the Olympic Games competition. You can see that in ancient Greek philosophy, debate and competition were very important. Whereas in ancient Chinese philosophy, it wasn't so important. People weren't really like having big debates and competing so much. Right? It was much more of kind of a society based on the idea of harmony. Right? In other words, for ancient Greece, debate and competition. Freedom was very, very important. Personal freedom is very, very important. It's one of the ideals. Whereas for ancient Chinese philosophy, freedom and competition wasn't really so important. It was much more important to try to have kind of harmonious lives, to be in harmony with others, to be in harmony with your society. Those are big differences. Kind of freedom, harmony. Freedom, harmony, right? Again, it's not always true, right? It's not always the case, but generally speaking, there were big differences of those sorts. So then you think, well, why? Why were ancient Greek and ancient Chinese philosophy so different? I mean, why was there this focus on competition, freedom in ancient Greece, whereas it was much more focused on harmonious relations in Chinese philosophy? Why was that? Well, both these cultures, both these early civilizations, they start with agriculture. Right? So you're growing food. You're growing food and you're staying in one place for long periods of time. Right? Before that, you're hunting food, you're gathering food, and the food's gone, you move on. Right? For these early civilizations, both ancient Greece and ancient China, you grow food and then you stay in one place for a longer time. So these early civilizations begin with agriculture, begin with farming, basically. And so there's, these skills for growing food are very, very important in both cases. But of course, the way that they were growing food is kind of different. So in other words, the way they were growing food in China and the way they were growing food in Greek civilizations were rather different. You can think about, ancient Chinese agriculture. It's going to be based on rice, much more than was the case with ancient Greece. And the earliest civilizations, let's say, for example, ancient Greece, right, and ancient China, to compare those, they're both civilizations about roughly the same time, as I said, about 5,000, 6,000, say, years ago. 3,000 years ago earlier actually, should be more like, that should be 5,000 years ago, actually, it's probably better. China may be a bit older, right? You could go back a little bit from that. 3,000 years ago, I suppose, would be, maybe that's a bit too early. Probably more like 5,000 years ago in China, in ancient Greek, a bit older for China, probably. And agriculture required cooperation, right? And whether it was in ancient China or in ancient Greece, in both of these forms, you have to cooperate. Right? Cooperation is very important for both civilizations. And as a result, because of agriculture, people could live in communities, they could develop these societies. They could work together, for example, to do things. But it seems like rice cultivation needed more cooperation. In ancient Greece, you did need to cooperate to cultivate food, but in ancient China, where rice cultivation was very, very important, then more cooperation was required. Yes, rice cultivation needed more cooperation. As a result, right, because of that, then the idea of social harmony became very, very important. More important than it was in the Western culture. So social harmony became very important. And I suppose social harmony and self-control. So in other words, you want to cooperate with other people. You want to be in harmony with other people. So controlling yourself became very, very important. Much more important than it was in Greece. And Greece was a bit different. Yeah. In the case of Greece, there was more of a mixed agriculture, different kinds of food. There's not so much focus on rice. And this is obviously because of the geography and because of the land and so on. It was a more mixed approach to agriculture. And also there was more trade in Greece, in ancient Greece. There were people coming from different places and moving around, going to different places. Get visitors from many different places. So there's a much more kind of mixed agriculture and also a mixed society. It wasn't all the same kind of people. People were coming from Africa and the Middle East and so on. It was kind of just more mixed. Agriculture was more mixed, and the people were more mixed. And so while cooperation was important in Greece, because cooperation is important everywhere, it wasn't the most important thing, right? So in other words, cooperation wasn't the most important thing for ancient Greek society. In other words, for East Asian societies, harmonious relations and cooperation were much more important. And in the Greek situation, then personal freedom became more important. You get the idea of competition, Olympic Games, for example. You get Greek drama, leisure activities, going to watch plays and things like that. Personal development, personal freedom, personal action, the individual action by the individual becomes much more important for the Greeks. Competition, the Olympic Games, for example, for personal development and personal action are kind of the ideal. You got debate, right? But you get people arguing with each other, people trying to come up with the best argument, right? To try to beat somebody else in argument. And this was very, very important leisure activity in ancient Greece. Whereas it wasn't really the case in China. So personal development, individual behavior, individual action is important. You get, for example, here you've got ancient Greek drama, where people would travel long distances to watch a play, to watch drama. And the whole idea was personal development, individual development. So visits to the theatre. Now, this was big, very, very big leisure activity in ancient Greece. And people would travel long distances to visit these theatres. Whereas for Chinese, right, visiting friends was the preferred leisure activity. Right? In other words, it wasn't really so much about personal development. It was more about kind of harmonious relations with other people, developing nice relations, connections with other people. So the preferred leisure activity for ancient Chinese was really visiting friends. You kind of these connections with other people, and hospitality became more important. And of course, if you think about Japan now, omotenashi and that sort of thing, and the idea of hospitality becomes very important. You have the tea ceremony, where sort of behaving nicely, relating to other people is very important. So those connections with other people. Hospitality becomes very, very important. Connections with other people, harmonious relations, social harmony, hospitality. And, in that situation, then competition and debate wasn't really encouraged so much. Right? You don't really, in ancient China, you don't really have this kind of focus on debate, on people arguing, because if you get people arguing, you kind of lose harmony, right? So that's not such a good idea. So the focus is much more on social harmony, harmonious relations, connections with other people, smooth connections with other people, rather than personal development. And disagreeing in public was not a good thing for the Chinese, for the ancient Chinese. In other words, you don't want to be arguing with somebody else in public. Maybe that person gets upset, maybe they get angry, maybe it creates a problem for your relationship. That's not really a very good idea, right? So there's a big difference. Debate for the ancient Chinese. You get these things growing from maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago and starting to really sort of become solid around 3,000 years ago. So in Greece, right, social harmony could be very damaged. Disharmony could be very, damaging for the Chinese. Yeah, you got all this water, right? You've got to make sure that the water is coming down into your fields and so on. Well, the connections with other people are very, very important. Right? If these people don't like you, they can kind of create problems. So if you have arguments, people are arguing in these situations, that can cause all kinds of problems. I think it makes sense. So you could say basically everybody likes freedom. So like the Chinese people, they like freedom. Japanese people like freedom and so on. But sometimes it goes too far. Right? Like you can say, for example, if you look at recent years with COVID, coronavirus, right, wearing masks, a lot of Americans got really upset about having to wear masks because they don't like the idea that they're not free. If you're wearing a mask, you feel like I have to wear a mask. I'm not free to not wear a mask. You're telling me what to do. And Americans got quite upset. And I think more upset than Japanese people, for example. Japanese people don't mind, think it's all right. It's doing it for the society, so that the society can deal with COVID better. People don't seem to mind, right? Whereas for Americans, oh, I'm losing my freedom by wearing a mask. A lot of people get really upset. And sometimes it goes a bit crazy, right? Just people really think freedom is very, very important. Too important, probably. Yeah. And, that's because, right, if personal freedom is the highest value, right, which is really rooted in ancient China, then you'd kind of expect people to get upset if their personal freedom is being limited. Yeah? It's my freedom, it's my body, it's my choice. I am free, right? So you can kind of understand it, but you can also see that sometimes it goes too far, becomes a bit crazy. Yeah? And in the case of like carrying guns, for example, right, this would be a really obvious example, really. People feel like I need to be free to carry guns. Well, for most of us, we think that's completely crazy, right? And that's just going too far, right? But you can kind of understand it, right? Because personal freedom is very important. Yeah. Anyway, that's the idea with sociocultural theory, right? We're very different because our minds develop in culture. Yeah. As because our minds develop in culture, then our minds are basically minds, are basically our culture, and a culture is our minds, right? Our minds and culture cannot really be separated. And the roots of our culture are very deep. Yeah, so deeply rooted in history. That's the way it works. And I recommend watching Japanese movies in English, using the English subtitles and using the English sound, for example, to watch Japanese movies. For example, if you watch Ghibli movies in English, listen to the English or look at the subtitles. Very often you can see big differences in the translation, and very often those differences kind of show that basic cultural difference. Whereas in the case of Japanese culture, there's more of a focus on the group, on the kind of collective, whereas in English, there's much more of a focus on the individual. And I think say, for example, in the case of Majun Totakyubin, what's that in English? Kiki's delivery service. You can really see this very, very clearly. The whole idea with the story from the Japanese perspective is that she's surrounded by kindness. Right? That's the song, actually, right? She's surrounded by kindness. It's because of the support, right? Because of the support of the society that she's able to be successful in the end. And I think if you look at the English words or English subtitles, there's much more of a focus on the individual. Right? It's like Kiki as an individual, as a special individual, right? A unique individual, right? So that's really how the story is understood. And I think it's kind of a difficult story for Westerners to understand in many ways, for that reason. But if you look at the subtitles, look at the words that are used, you can see that people are understanding it much more as a story of an individual rather than the story of the group, the community, the support of the community. And I think that's really interesting. And as I say, I think very often Japanese movies are, difficult for Westerners to understand, because I think there is more of a focus on the community, more of a focus on the group. But that's interesting, right? I mean, that's really like you think, well, how do you understand this? Right? How do you make sense of this? Why do these exist? Why do these differences exist? And how does it help us to understand what's happening? Yeah. So anyway, sometimes it's difficult. And because it's difficult, then the dialogue's changed to make things easier. And there's loads and loads of examples of this. And in class, actually, I look at some of these examples and try to make sense of it. How do we explain that? Right? So the English, the English dialogue actually is quite different from the Japanese dialogue in many, many cases. So anyway, cultures are different, right? I mean, we know that. We started off with the example of shoes. You take your shoes off when you go in the house. It's much more likely in Japan. Not so much in Western countries. More likely to keep your shoes on in the house than you are in Japan. It's not always true, of course. I mean, actually, in my house, we used to take our shoes off, but generally speaking, there is a difference. Right? Cultures are different, and it's kind of easy to say what the differences are. Sometimes it's a bit more difficult to answer why they're different. So cultures are different. I suppose you could say, actually, that's why they're interesting. It's the differences that make it interesting. In other words, we're all the same deep down. Right? Human beings are human beings. We're all basically the same at a very deep level. But at the same time, we're very different. And it's those differences, right? It's those differences that make things interesting. So, again, if you come back to the original example, we know what the difference is. It's easy to say this. We look at the Western style house. It's quite a nice house. You can see that and everything. If you look at that, and if you look at this Japanese style house, you can see there's quite a big difference here. There's the outside, and almost you open the door and immediately you're inside. Yeah. I guess there's a little mat here for you to sort of wipe your feet a little bit. Yeah. So people, they don't want to upset people. Maybe you want to clean your shoes a little bit, but it's not as important. Whereas in the Japanese style house, you can see this big area here. There's a big area for guests, right? And all these shoes laid out, right? So it's actually sort of to welcome the guest, social harmony, hospitality, welcoming the guests. You will think, well, okay, so how do you explain that? Well, in the case of Western culture, you'd probably want to say that hospitality, right? Hospitality isn't quite as important, right, in Western culture. In this case, the individual's home, right, and freedom to behave the way they want to is kind of more important. Whereas in the case of the Japanese house, which is connected with Chinese culture, ancient Chinese culture, and so on, there's much more of a focus on hospitality, on connections with the group, connections with people from outside, and maintaining harmony, social harmony, is more important. So in other words, you don't want to come in and make a mess. Right? If you come into the house and you bring in dirt into the house, that kind of makes it messy, makes things dirty. You're going to upset the host, going to make the host angry. And that's something you really don't want to do, because social harmony is much more important. In the case of the Western style house, the individual is more important. But that's the outside, that's the inside. These are really two totally different spaces. There's a clear gap, right? Clear difference between the outside the house and inside the house. And it's kind of, marking the individual in many ways. Whereas in the Japanese style house, it's a kind of space here where it's kind of inside and outside at the same time, which connects people on the inside and people on the outside in a way which is, harmonious, right? Trying to be as harmonious as possible. And so anyway, that's the basic idea. The suggestion is that, Westerners tend to see the object, the individual object, the individual experience, kind of focus on that. You'll see the tree, for example, right? The individual thing, the thing itself. And even when it comes to learning language, they will learn nouns faster than they learn verbs. Right? So in other words, words connected with thing, with an object, a single individual thing or object, they're going to learn faster than verbs, whereas East Asians, Japanese, certainly appear to learn verbs faster than nouns. In other words, the words which connect things. Right? I see you, like see connects a subject and an object. Words that connect, like verbs, are learned more quickly by Japanese. Right? So there's connections. The idea is that Westerners see the object, whereas East Asians see the connections, see the substance, they see the connections, the relationships between two things. Now, you could ask, which one is better? Which is better? Is it better to be like Western people, or is it better to be like Asian people? It's difficult to answer that. But I think you could say that in many ways, right? In many ways, it's easier for Asian people to understand what's happening. Yeah? If you understand the connections, or you understand the situation, then maybe it's easier for you to understand what's going on. Right? If you don't see the connections, if you don't see the background, you don't see the connections, then maybe it's more difficult to understand. So it's a difficult question to answer, but I think maybe, if you're going to say if anything, then probably East Asian people do have an advantage. Right? They are able to see the connections, and they are able to understand what's going on better than Western people. Right? And if that's true, then maybe then you have an opportunity, right? You have an opportunity to understand differences and help people to understand what's going on, right? Because maybe it's easier for you. It's easier for you to see things, easier for you to see the connections. So maybe it's easier for you to understand. But if that's true, well, maybe it's good because you can help people to understand things. So that I hope that would motivate you to study hard. Yeah. But anyway, cultural differences. There are cultural differences. Why do they exist? How do we understand them? Generally, we understand them in terms of history. And talking about history that goes back 5,000, 6,000 years. It starts to become very different around 3,000 years ago. So very deep-rooted cultural differences. Okay, anyway, I hope that helps you understand. There's the basic idea. Our minds develop in culture, and culture develops in history, right? And that is basically how we understand these cultural differences. They're rooted in very deep history. Okay, and guys, anyway, I hope that was useful. And I'll put up a little quiz, right, to go along with this, to just sort of see if you've followed some of the things I've been saying. So I hope you'll do the quiz, and you can send me your answers, and that will help me to understand whether you're getting things or not. Okay, guys? So anyway, I'll stop there, and I'll put this up. And yeah, don't forget to do the quiz if you feel like it, I suppose. Right? I'll put the quiz up. It won't be very difficult. It'll be quite an easy quiz, not very many questions. But I hope you'll do it, and I hope that'll be helpful. We know there are cultural differences. How do you understand them? How do you understand the differences? Why do they exist? Okay then, guys, I'll stop there. Bye-bye.